Thank you so much for joining today's session. So we've now come to our unit 5, where we have to be able to write a computer program. So what have we covered so far in our unit, which is Introduction to Computer Programming? We've looked into 4 of our major learning outcomes. We looked into describing how computer program languages are used to meet business needs. So we explain the computer programming that are available. We also looked into which ones are more in demand and in which sector we now find them. After that, we looked into understanding how computer programming will now meet our business requirement. So depending on each sector, we will now have a technology which will be most suitable for them to accomplish their goal. So we made example of healthcare sector and how emerging technologies are used, such as Python, which is very much used in artificial intelligence and machine learning. Then we looked into Facebook, which created React, which is a framework that is used in various software applications, various web applications out there. Also, we also introduced the fundamentals of programming. We looked into explaining the features of them. We explained the range of data types and when we need to use them. We looked into declaring them, also how we have to declare our variable, our data types. Then we explain the use of variables in programming and variables and constant. We looked into keyword, logical and arithmetical operators. Then we looked into conditions in programming, such as our if, else statement and our loops. And then we ended up explaining arrays and function methods. Also, in the following tutorial, we looked into explaining the characteristics of different programming languages. So we looked at understanding why one programming language would be more suitable rather than using another one. And also we looked into explaining the advantages and disadvantages when it comes to programming. So without any further ado, let's get into our presentation. So in today's session, we also introduced the concept of object-oriented programming, where we looked into abstraction, encapsulation, polymorphism, and inheritance. Today's session, we're now going to identify a problem to solve using a computer program. We're going to write a basic code sequence to solve a program. We'll now explain the code using comment and create a test plan and carry out a testing on the computer programming using our test plan. So from our learning outcome, by the end of this unit, you as a learner, you will now be able to identify and solve a problem using a basic computer program, write and explain simple code, test and evaluate your program, use a range of functions to enhance your program. So when it comes to identifying the problem, here we have an example where we're now going to create a calculator that will add, subtract, multiply, and divide two numbers. So how a program can solve this? we now know that our program we now have to activate our scanner. So depending on the programming language, we need to have the ability to give an input. So if it comes to Java, we now have to declare our scanner, perform the calculation, and we have to have the ability to display our result. So when it comes to implementing this with Java, we will now have our main class, where our main class will now call it as calculator. And we're now going to activate our scanner. So we always have to import from our library java.util scanner, which allows us to input into our keyboard. Then once we have activated our scanner, we now have to write a simple text message, which will now give the input for our we're going to give the input for our user, where our message simply asking enter your first number. So in this case, our data type is going to be a double instead of an integer. So our user could enter any decimal number. So it can enter 1099 or 599, any sort of double decimal number we want. Then again, we'll have a second message which is asking us to enter a second number. We'll repeat the same process. Then we'll now ask our users to choose our operation, where they'll now choose which logical arithmetical calculation we want this to perform. Once this has now been entered by our user, we now have a switch. We now have our condition. So we now choose to use a switch where we'll have different options depending on what the user selected. So it is very important for us to always add comments to our code, where we're now going to explain what we're doing, because we made the example that when it comes to working in a team, we might not be the only people who are accessing this project. So it is very important to add comment whenever a function or calculation has been added into the project. So here we have an example where we explain what we did for this program. So we get the input from our user, where we activated our scanner, asked for 2 numbers and operations, and then we simply performed the operation using a switch statement. When it comes to our testing plan, we need to be able to validate the calculation that we did. So when it comes to programming, it is very important to understand system development life cycle, which is basically a life cycle, and there are different methodologies such as Agile, Waterfall, Scrum, and Extreme Programming, or many others out there. So when it comes to working in a project, testing is always one of the final part of our system development life cycle. And what happens is that we need to be able to validate our code and what we've written. And this validation can happen with several numbers of tests. So here we perform 3 testing, which will now include various input. various type of input, and each of them has to be accurate. So we can see that from the first two examples, both of them successfully passed our testing plan, while we now input a third one, which was able to give us an invalid output because the values that have been entered cannot be calculated. This will now throw an error, as you can see. So we also have to have the ability to reviewing and evaluating our code. So when it comes to reviewing and evaluating, we need to look at the positive side of things. We need to ask ourselves what went well, accept users' input. You're also able to handle operations correctly. Also, when it comes to future improvement, during our evaluation, we need to look at what we can improve. So we can now add an input validation, which has to help us ensure that the validation is as accurate as possible. Also, we add an option to repeat the calculation as well. So this could be possible future improvement. So when it comes to using a range of functions, so we made an example by activating the scanner or using the switch for decision. This can be widely range of function, or also implementing object-oriented programming can reduce the line of code that we now using to solve our problem, and it also help us have more clarity and readability of our code. So here we have an example of additional functionality, where again here we basically going to use object-oriented programming, where we're going to create a reusable method. So for example, we now have our main class with our public static double. We now code our class as calculate. So we now pass in the parameters of two doubles, which are A and B, and then we activate we are passing a character of OP. So we'll now have to enter our method in here, and once our method has been entered, we have to have the ability to calculate and test in order to see if our function is working effectively. Okay, so let me just quickly, let's just get to the conclusion of this. So what have we covered so far? We were able to identify a problem. We were given with an example of our calculator. We were able to choose a suitable programming language for the implementation of our calculation. Then we choose also which conditional statement to use, where we decided to now implement this using a switch. We were able to perform testing on validating our lines of code. And also lastly, we also looked into advanced functionality, where we now use methods and passed different type of parameters. So this was everything for today's session, where we've now covered our learning outcome 5. So in the next tutorial, we'll now look into our assignment discussion, how we will now look into solving any sort of queries or doubts that you guys might have. Thank you everyone for joining, and have a good day.